Welcome to today's episode, The Devil's Bargain Negotiating with Aggressors. I'm your host, and we're joined by a renowned expert in international relations. We'll dive into the complex issue of negotiating with aggressors like Russia, given their history of breaking ceasefires and violating international law.
Hmm, that's really interesting. So how do you think we should approach negotiations with countries like Russia? Should we prioritize pragmatism or principle?
Well, it's a difficult question. On one hand, negotiating with aggressors can lead to temporary ceasefires and a reduction in violence. However, it can also be seen as legitimizing their actions and undermining the principles of international law.
Right? I see what you mean. But don't we have a moral obligation to protect human life, even if it means negotiating with aggressors?
Yes, that's a valid point. However, we also need to consider the long-term consequences of our actions. If we negotiate with aggressors without holding them accountable for their actions, we may be creating a precedent that encourages further aggression in the future.
I never thought of it that way. Can you give me an example of how this has played out in the past?
Well, let's take the case of Ukraine and Russia. Russia has consistently broken ceasefires and violated international law, yet we continue to negotiate with them. This has led to a cycle of violence and instability in the region.
Oh, wow. That's really concerning. So, what do you think is the best approach moving forward?
I think we need to find a balance between pragmatism and principle. We should negotiate with aggressors, but also hold them accountable for their actions. This can involve imposing economic sanctions, supporting international institutions, and promoting human rights.
That makes sense. But how do we ensure that our actions are effective in the long term?
That's a great question. I think it requires a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and international cooperation. We need to work with other countries to create a united front against aggression and promote a rules-based international order.
I see what you mean. It's a complex issue, but I think we need to prioritize principle over pragmatism. We can't just negotiate with aggressors without holding them accountable for their actions.
I agree. However, we also need to be realistic about the limitations of our power and the complexity of international relations. Sometimes, negotiating with aggressors may be the only way to prevent further violence and protect human life.
Right? I think I'm starting to understand the nuances of this issue. But what about the role of international institutions in all of this? How can they help promote a rules-based order?
Great question. International institutions like the United Nations and the European Union play a crucial role in promoting international law and holding aggressors accountable. They provide a framework for cooperation and diplomacy and can impose sanctions on countries that violate international law.
That's really interesting. So, what do you think is the most important thing we can do to promote peace and stability in regions like Ukraine?
I think it's a combination of things. We need to support international institutions, promote human rights, and hold aggressors accountable for their actions. We also need to engage in diplomacy and negotiation, but from a position of strength and principle.
Right? I think that makes sense. But what about the role of individual leaders in all of this? Can they make a difference in promoting peace and stability?
Absolutely. Individual leaders can play a crucial role in shaping international relations and promoting peace and stability. They can use their diplomatic power to bring parties together, promote dialogue, and find creative solutions to complex problems.
I see what you mean. So, what do you think is the most important quality for a leader to have when negotiating with aggressors?
I think it's a combination of strength, principle, and empathy. A leader needs to be strong and resolute in their principles, but also empathetic and understanding of the perspectives of all parties involved.
Right? I think that makes sense. But how do we ensure that our leaders have those qualities?
That's a great question. I think it requires a combination of things, including education, experience, and a deep understanding of international relations and diplomacy. We also need to hold our leaders accountable for their actions and promote transparency and accountability in government.
I see what you mean. It's a complex issue, but I think we need to prioritize principle over pragmatism when negotiating with aggressors. We can't just negotiate without holding them accountable for their actions.
I agree. However, we also need to be realistic about the limitations of our power and the complexity of international relations. Sometimes, negotiating with aggressors may be the only way to prevent further violence and protect human life. And that's why we need to approach these negotiations with a combination of strength, principle, and empathy.
Right? I think I'm starting to understand the nuances of this issue. Thanks for explaining it to me.
You're welcome. It's a complex issue, but I hope this conversation has helped shed some light on the challenges and opportunities of negotiating with aggressors. Next up, we're discussing the recent meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump in the Oval Office. The testy exchange began with Vice President J.D. Vance praising Trump for negotiating directly with Russia over ending the war that started with Russia's 2022 invasion and occupation of Ukraine. Zelensky argued that Russia's prior actions have shown it to be an untrustworthy diplomatic partner, to which Vance responded that the Ukrainian president was being disrespectful to Trump.
I'm not sure I understand why President Zelensky would decline to apologize to President Trump after their heated exchange. Can you explain the context behind this decision? Right.
Well, it seems that President Zelensky is trying to assert Ukraine's sovereignty and independence in the face of Russian aggression. By not apologizing, he may be attempting to demonstrate that Ukraine will not back down or compromise its values in the face of pressure from other nations.
That makes sense, I guess. But what about President Trump's claims that he can negotiate a deal with Russia and end the war? Do you think that's realistic?
Right, well, it's complicated. While President Trump has expressed his desire to make a deal, the situation on the ground is complex, and there are many factors at play. Ukraine's concerns about Russian aggression and the need for security guarantees are legitimate, and it's unclear whether a deal can be reached that addresses these concerns.
I see what you mean. So, what role do you think economic sanctions should play in resolving this conflict? Shouldn't they be used to pressure Russia into negotiating?
Great question. Economic sanctions can be a useful tool in certain situations, but their effectiveness depends on various factors, such as the specific goals of the sanctions, the target country's economy, and the level of international cooperation. In this case,
Interrupting. Right. Sorry to interrupt, but what about the potential impact on civilians? I've heard that economic sanctions can have devastating effects on ordinary people.
Exactly. You're absolutely right to consider the human cost of economic sanctions. They can lead to food and medicine shortages, inflation, and even humanitarian crises. It's essential to carefully weigh these consequences against the potential benefits of using sanctions as a tool for resolving conflicts.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it that way. So, what do you think is the best approach to resolving this conflict?
Well, pauses, I think a comprehensive and nuanced approach is needed, one that takes into account the complex historical, cultural, and economic factors at play. This might involve a combination of diplomatic efforts, economic support for Ukraine, and targeted sanctions against Russia, while also prioritizing the protection of civilians and minimizing harm to innocent people.
Okay. I think I understand. It's just so complicated, you know? But thanks for explaining it in a way that makes sense.
Laughs, of course. Conflicts like this one are always complex, but by breaking down the issues and considering different perspectives, we can gain a deeper understanding of what's at stake and how to move forward.